Hey guys, tonight we'll uncover a royal secret that has been buried for 500 years. The story of the illegitimate daughter King Henry VIII dared not acknowledge. Throughout history, we always remember Henry VIII for his 6 wives and his desperate obsession with a male heir. He was willing to tear England away from the Catholic Church just to achieve that. But did you know that, amidst that religious and political storm, there existed a woman in the shadows, carrying Tudor blood but forced to pose as the bastard daughter of a tailor? She was raised with inexplicable wealth, educated like a princess. Yet her name was erased from all official records. Imagine this. Her father was the most powerful king in Europe, but she was never allowed to call him that. Her mother was a laundress, but she wore expensive silk and velvet gowns. Her destiny was meticulously arranged by Henry VIII himself, not to protect her, but to safeguard the throne. As she grew up, she was seen standing beside Queen Elizabeth I during the most perilous moments, as if they were half-sisters, as if a silent vow was binding them. This is not just a tale of historical rumours. This is the story of a woman who was turned into a ghost in royal clothing by her own father, a living proof of the Tudor court's deception, and a truth that was only revealed in the last will of a father on paper. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, let me know where you're relaxing and what your current local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There was once a girl born with royal blood, though that crimson thread running quietly beneath her skin meant little in a world shaped by crowns, succession, and the cold arithmetic of power. Had she come into the world as a son, her path would have been carved in gold from the very beginning. She would have lived in palaces, walked across polished stone under painted ceilings, received titles, estates, and a place clear and unshakable in the heavy books of English history. But she was born a daughter. And in the realm ruled by King Henry VIII, a daughter born outside wedlock was not a blessing, not a symbol of strength or virility, but an inconvenience the crown did not need. So her entire life was folded into a quiet, narrow shape, the shape of a bastard child claimed by the king's personal tailor. Her father on paper, John Malty, could give her shelter, could give her clothes, could even give her a measure of comfort through the grants placed into his hands. But he could not give her the one thing that would have changed everything: the Tudor name. He could not give her the right to speak aloud, the identity of the man whose face she carried, the man whose blood determined the polished, careful education she received. Meanwhile, in a jarring contrast that must have felt like a shadow slicing across her own life, King Henry VIII openly and proudly acknowledged his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. The boy was treated not as a mistake, not as a stain, but as a triumph. The king paraded him in public, showered him with gold, dressed him in fine velvet, granted him lands and titles. When the boy was only 6 years old, Henry raised him to Duke of Richmond and Duke of Somerset, proof, for the watching world, that the king could father sons, that the problem lay not in him but elsewhere, silently pointed toward Queen Catherine of Aragon. But for a daughter outside of marriage, reality turned cold. She could not be shown off as a symbol of potency. She could not be used to silence gossip. She could only become a liability. She might grow into a danger, a seed from which inconvenient claims or alliances could sprout. So instead of being displayed, she was tucked away. Instead of being offered glittering halls, she was given a name crafted for concealment. Instead of being allowed to stand as who she was, she became a secret the court needed to bury. And so Ethelreda, the small girl whose life brushed the edges of power without ever being allowed to step into its center, grew up in the shadows cast by the Tudor throne. She lived close enough to royalty to feel its warmth, close enough to hear its murmurs, close enough that her fingertips might have grazed the hem of destiny, yet she was never permitted to claim any of it. She moved like a ghost among the living, a girl raised neither as a servant nor as a princess, existing in a narrow place between visibility and erasure. By the time the Tudor court had taken from her all it needed, her silence, her distance, her invisibility, it attempted to sweep away every trace of her existence. As if she were a smudge on the edge of a page, something to be rubbed out rather than read. But truth does not vanish simply because a king wishes it so. Some truths linger with a quiet persistence, waiting for the moment when history grows careless. That moment arrived when John Maltby died, in the year 1546. In the tender folds of his final will, hidden among the formal lines and legal phrasing, lay a clue small but sharp enough to slice through 5 centuries of silence. A clue that pointed back toward the throne, toward the man who had rewritten the story of her birth, and toward the secret whispered only in guarded corners. The story of the daughter, King Henry VIII, never dared to acknowledge. To understand Ethelreda, we must drift backward, slowly and quietly, as though sinking through layers of dim water, until we reach the years between 1527 and 1533. Those 6 years formed the trembling ground on which her entire life would be built. In that span of time, King Henry VIII was consumed utterly, restlessly by his determination to annul his marriage to Queen Catherine of Aragon and bind himself instead to Anne Boleyn. His longing for Anne was not a gentle affection. It was an obsession, a fever that tightened around him until he was willing to tear England itself away from Rome. He broke from the Pope, split from the Catholic Church, and reshaped the faith of a kingdom, all for the chance to marry one woman. And yet, despite the fire of his desire, Anne Boleyn held firm. She refused to sleep with the king before marriage. She knew the peril of yielding too soon. She knew that her value in Henry's eyes depended on remaining beyond his reach, a prize he could see, but not yet touch. Henry, for political reasons and for the sake of the annulment he sought, had also ceased sharing a bed with Catherine of Aragon. Their marital separation was not only emotional but physical years of distance built atop years of disappointment. So, on the surface, the story England told itself was this: the king had remained pure for 7 full years while he waited for Rome to dissolve his first marriage. 7 years of celibacy. 7 years of restraint. 7 years of a man as powerful and impulsive as Henry VIII keeping his desires tightly locked away. That alone feels like a fairy tale whispered to soothe political discomfort rather than a truth rooted in human nature. The historian Amy License, calm and precise, put it plainly: if we cannot believe that Henry stayed chaste for nearly a decade, and few scholars genuinely can, then we must accept that he was sleeping with someone. But obsession has its limits. Henry would never have risked his future with Anne Boleyn by taking a high-born mistress, not when he was trying to reshape England's religious and political landscape for her sake. A noble lover could attract gossip, competition, danger. A noble lover could ruin everything. And so, as many noblemen of the period did, Henry turned his attention toward women from lower ranks, women who understood the delicate boundaries of their station, women who knew not to ask for legitimacy, not to expect marriage, not to imagine themselves elevated by a single fleeting encounter. Women who appeared when summoned and vanished when dismissed. Women whose names were unlikely to be recorded, whose footsteps echoed softly in corridors meant for others. It was within this dim, unrecorded space, a space made of silence, secrecy, and hurried moments, that the story of Joan Dingley, and later the story of Ethelreda, began to take shape. This was the space where the king's desire met discretion, where secrecy was safer than truth, where the boundaries of power blurred just long enough for a life to be conceived. In these years, Joan Dingley lived and worked inside the royal household. She was a laundress, a position that seemed humble to those who did not understand its closeness to the king's daily life. Laundresses scrubbed stains from linen, boiled water until steam cracked their hands, wrung out heavy fabrics until their arms ached. Yet they also handled the most intimate items a man could own. They washed his shirts, his bedding, and sometimes the underclothes worn closest to his skin. They knew which chambers he used, which nights he returned late, which mornings he rose early. They passed through spaces where guards stepped aside. They had access not granted to just anyone. Joan lived in this world of hush and heat and water, close enough to the king's private life to understand its rhythms. Henry, restless and frustrated, seeking comfort outside the tangled politics surrounding Anne Boleyn, may well have found in Joan the anonymity and the simplicity he needed. A woman with no title, no ambition, no political ties. A woman who could not threaten Anne's future. A woman whose name would never appear in diplomatic letters or foreign correspondence. There, in the quiet margins of the court between steaming basins, folded linens, and the clatter of servants' footsteps, something happened. Something small, secret, unrecorded. Joan Dingley became pregnant. And that is where the path of Ethelreda began. Not in a palace hall, not in a gilded cradle, but in the quiet shadows of a king's desire, in the space where power and secrecy intertwined. This is where her story truly takes its first breath. Joan Dingley, the woman whose quiet life eventually intersected with the fate of Ethelreda, worked inside the royal household as a laundress, a role that sounded humble, tiring, and endlessly repetitive to anyone observing from a distance. Her hands were always plunged into boiling water. Her sleeves were heavy with damp cloth. Her skin held the lingering scent of soap, steam, and long hours. Yet beneath that modest title lay a truth most people forgot. Laundresses saw everything. They washed the king's shirts after long days of court ritual. They changed the sheets from his bed, sheets that told more stories than any chronicler ever could. They knew which rooms he slept in, which doors opened late at night, which corners of the palace fell silent, and which hours the guards drifted from their posts. They moved in and out of spaces that many noblemen never saw, carrying linens that had touched the body of the king himself. The personnel list at Eltham in the year 1526 recorded Anne Harris as the chief napery laundress, responsible for all cloths, table linens, and the order of the washing chambers. Beneath her supervision, there must have been several assistants. Joan may well have been one of those unseen hands beneath the name at the top of the page. It is equally possible that she worked even closer to the king's private life, directly inside the privy chamber, where the most personal garments were stored and laundered. In that space, a laundress would not be merely a servant. She would be someone who stepped into the king's private world, someone who observed details of his daily rhythms without ever being noticed in return. The historian Amy Licence highlights a small but razor-sharp detail. If Henry VIII ever wished to seduce a laundress, it would not have been a random woman tucked away in distant corridors. It would have been the woman who handled his underclothing, the one who stepped quietly into his private rooms, the one who knew the subtle, intimate details of his body simply by the work she did with her hands. Joan fits this possibility with uncomfortable precision. She was close enough to the king's garments to understand the shape of his life, yet low enough in rank that her presence would never raise questions. For a long time, the exchanges between them would have been unremarkable, delivering freshly washed shirts, collecting soiled linen, stepping quietly into chambers where the air still held the king's warmth. But over days, weeks, or months, something changed in the quiet rhythm of her work. No record shows how their interactions first shifted. No document captures whether the king's gaze lingered over her one afternoon, or whether Joan's presence simply offered the anonymity he needed while he waited restlessly for permission to marry Anne Boleyn. Yet at some point, during those unrecorded moments between the arrival and return of linen, Joan Dingley became pregnant. Her pregnancy did not create a scandal, because scandals only bloom when names are attached. Joan's name was not important to the court, but her child was a problem that required a solution as swift, silent, and airtight as the palace could create. The royal household could not afford curiosity. It needed someone loyal, discreet, and indispensable. So their attention turned to the king's tailor. John Maltby had served Henry VIII faithfully since the year 1527. He stitched the king's doublets, mended his cloaks, and tailored garments that shaped the king's imposing presence. He was trusted, measured, and accustomed to hearing things he could never repeat. The agreement given to him would never be written down, but its terms were unmistakable. He would claim the child. He would raise her as his own bastard daughter. He would remain silent about anything he might know, anything he might suspect, anything he might be told. In exchange, there would be land. There would be wealth. There would be security. There would be a future far beyond the reach of any tailor's household. Whether Maltby accepted willingly or found himself with no real choice is lost to time. Perhaps he saw opportunity. Perhaps he saw danger. Perhaps the truth sits somewhere between those two shadows. Still, the arrangement held firm. When the child was born, she bore Maltby's name, but her life unfolded like a life belonging to someone else. Her clothing was finer than any tailor's daughter should have worn. Her education surpassed what any servant's child could expect. Her path was shaped by decisions made far above her station. That child was Ethelreda Malt, a girl given a saint's name, yet destined to live with a secret carved deep beneath the surface of her identity. She bore the surname of the tailor who raised her, but her life, her upbringing, and the strange protection surrounding her all whispered of another man entirely, a man who sat on a throne and could never acknowledge her. She was a girl with more than one name, as if the world itself could not decide where to place her. Some called her Ethelreda, some called her Audrey, and occasionally she appeared in records as Esther or even Easter. 3 or 4 names for a single life, a quiet reflection of the uncertainty surrounding her identity. Even those who lived beside her seemed unsure of who she truly was, or who she was supposed to be. Her most formal name, Ethelreda, carried the weight of history. It was the name of a saint, and also the name of an Anglo-Saxon princess, the daughter of King Anna of East Anglia, a princess who later became a nun and founded a religious house. The feast day of that saint fell on the 23rd of June, and some have gently suggested that the date might hint at the day when Ethelreda Moult was born. Yet no official document confirms it. For illegitimate children, especially those whose births were meant to remain hidden, there were no neat announcements, no careful entries in parish books, no midwives called to offer formal testimony. There was only silence. Historians, attempting to trace her life through faint trails of evidence, have placed her birth somewhere between the year 1527 and the year 1535. This estimate comes from the strange and generous flow of land grants and property that began falling into the hands of John Malty, her supposed father, soon after that span of years. Such wealth, gifted so suddenly to a tailor, seems too purposeful, too targeted, to belong to coincidence. And so scholars have gently positioned her birth in that broad window, knowing that the true year lies somewhere hidden within it, unrecorded, unspoken, forever lost to the quiet in which she entered the world. On paper, she was registered as the illegitimate daughter of John Malta and Joan Dingley, who also appeared under the name Dobson in certain documents. Malty served as a tailor in the king's great wardrobe, stitching royal garments, repairing what needed mending, and ensuring that the king's clothing communicated power with every fold. Joan worked as a laundress, handling garments heavy with water and royal scent. Both were common folk, servants whose names would normally never rise beyond the margins of household lists. Yet their daughter grew up in fabrics far finer than anything Moult could have afforded, much less a laundress. Silk brushed against her skin. Velvet whispered when she moved. Her clothing, her surroundings, even the manner in which she carried herself, all spoke of a care that stretched beyond the means of a tailor. She was taught to read, she was taught to write. She learned manners, deportment, and the precise social graces reserved for the daughters of the gentry. This was not the education of a servant's child. It was the education of someone who needed to be raised carefully, discreetly, deliberately. Someone who needed to move comfortably among women of high rank without drawing questions. Someone who needed to appear polished, yet stay unclaimed. Her life existed in a strange tension. She was lifted up, dressed in privilege, surrounded by quiet guidance, yet never acknowledged for what that education implied. She was allowed glimpses of a world just beyond her reach, allowed to stand near the threshold of power, but forbidden from stepping inside. Every advantage she received came wrapped in silence. Every piece of luxury was paired with deliberate absence. No title, no lineage, no declaration of who she truly belonged to. And so she lived as a child, balanced on the narrow edge of two worlds. On one side was the world of servants, where her parents' names on paper placed her. On the other side was the world of nobility, where every aspect of her upbringing seemed to lead, but she could not claim either place fully. She was too well educated to belong among the servants, and too unacknowledged to belong among the highborn. She existed in the liminal space between both realms, privileged but nameless, elevated but concealed, guided yet never introduced. This was the shape of her life. Advantages without identity, comfort without recognition, a path carefully prepared for her yet never openly justified. She grew up standing at the edge of a world she was not allowed to enter, not because she lacked worth, but because she carried the weight of an illegitimate birth that powerful people needed to hide. Everything about her life whispered of a truth that could not be spoken, a truth that shaped her destiny long before she understood its meaning. To understand this cold injustice, we must look closely at how King Henry VIII treated his illegitimate children. When Henry Fitzroy, his illegitimate son, came into the world, the king showed no hesitation at all in claiming him. When the boy reached the age of 6, Henry granted him the titles of Duke of Richmond and Duke of Somerset, raising him to a level of prominence that only the most powerful noble families could dream of. An entire household was formed for the child, complete with servants, tutors, lands, and a structure that mirrored the upbringing of a prince. For a time, serious whispers circulated through courtly halls that Henry might even name Fitzroy as heir to the English throne. The reason was painfully simple. Fitzroy was male, and his existence alone proved that Henry could father a son in a world obsessed with lineage, legitimacy, and succession. Fitzroy became a political declaration, a living message directed toward Queen Catherine of Aragon, suggesting that the failure to produce a male heir lay not with the king but with his wife. Yet the moment the child in question was a girl, everything changed. An illegitimate daughter carried none of the symbolic power that an illegitimate son did. A girl could not ascend the throne without dragging the kingdom toward the shadow of civil war. But she could be married off to foreign princes, ambitious noblemen, or unpredictable allies. She could become the center of political debates the king could not control. She could be used by rivals as a claim, a pawn, or a spark to ignite unrest. In short, illegitimate daughters were dangerous in a way illegitimate sons were not. Sons strengthened a king's image. Daughters threatened to unravel it. Ethelreda stood exactly in this precarious place. She was too dangerous to acknowledge openly because of the potential political chaos her recognition might create. Yet she was also far too valuable to abandon. If raised carefully, she could be useful, loyal, safe. If neglected, she might fall into the hands of those who wished to exploit her connection to the crown. And so Henry did what kings so often did when confronted with inconvenient realities. He rewrote the story to protect himself. He transformed John Malty, the tailor who had agreed to claim the child, into a wealthy man almost overnight. Through sudden land grants, manorial rights, and unexpected flows of royal favour, Malty gained resources far beyond what a servant of his station could ever hope to earn through honest craft. His rise was abrupt, dramatic, and perfectly timed, as if someone had scripted each new acquisition to build the image of a man fully capable of raising a child in comfort. To those who watched from outside, Malty appeared fortunate, favoured, perhaps even rewarded for skill. But the truth, hidden beneath layers of silence, was that Henry needed Malty to look wealthy enough to explain why the girl in his care lived as she did. Henry ensured that Ethelreda lived near the centre of courtly life. She was educated well, dressed well, and raised in a world that taught her how to move among nobles without drawing suspicion. Yet all this occurred without any public recognition of her true bloodline. She remained hidden in plain sight, a carefully placed shadow beside the throne. She was not permitted to step forward as a princess, but she was not allowed to sink into the life of a servant either. She existed in the narrow, uncertain space between the two, preserved but never acknowledged. Her life took on the shape of a paradox. She lived richly but without a name that matched her circumstances. She walked through corridors whispering with power, yet her identity was locked behind a wall of silence. She was visible and invisible at the same time, carried forward by the privileges bestowed upon her, yet denied the right to claim the father whose decisions shaped every detail of her upbringing. She became, in the end, a royal ghost, a girl cloaked in luxury, raised with intention, guided by invisible hands, yet stripped of public recognition because she was born a daughter in a world where that single fact determined everything. Her existence hovered at the edge of the throne, near enough to feel its warmth, but always kept just far enough that she could never touch it. Strange things began to unfold around Ethelreda as she grew older, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as if the very fabric of the Tudor court could no longer hold its own secrets in place. The signs appeared not in whispers or rumours, but in the form of gifts far too large, far too costly, far too deliberate to be dismissed as mere royal generosity. In the month of May, in the year 1541, John Malty, a tailor of entirely ordinary birth, suddenly received from the king a reward that no amount of needlework could ever justify. He was granted estates, manors, and lands in the county of Berkshire, including Watchfield and Uffington. both formerly owned by monastic houses, dissolved during Henry's sweeping religious reforms. These were not simple patches of farmland. They came with the authority to appoint clergy, to collect tithes, and to govern tenants' privileges reserved for those firmly rooted in the ranks of the gentry or nobility. 3 years later, in the month of July, in the year 1544, another royal grant followed. This time, the recipients were clearly named John Malty and his daughter, Ethelreda. They were granted more than £18 worth of property in Somerset, land that had belonged to Glastonbury Abbey before Henry tore the abbey down during the dissolution. And then, in the month of September, in the year 1546, yet another gift arrived. More than £13 worth of land, including the lordship and manor of Kelston, along with other connected properties. When translated into modern value, the combined worth of these rewards surpasses £400,000, a fortune that would have caused envy among knights who had devoted generations to building their estates. But a tailor, no matter how loyal or skilled, could not rise to such wealth through stitching doublets and mending cloaks. No craftsman, however dedicated, could leap overnight into the upper ranks of landholding gentry solely because his work pleased the king. The sudden accumulation of these estates was not a reward. It was the price of silence. Someone needed John Malty to play the role of father convincingly. Someone needed the world to believe a tidy story, a tailor, a laundress, and a child born out of wedlock. Someone needed the truth buried deep enough that no curious mind could accidentally unearth it. And the only person with the power to orchestrate such a transformation was the king himself, Henry VIII. Piece by piece, the fragments began to glow like candlelight slipping through cracks in a darkened room. The gifts that were too large to be ignored. The arrangements that made no rational sense. The privileges Malty suddenly possessed without any explanation rooted in his craft or his previous status. All of these threads wove together into a single, unmistakable pattern. They pointed away from the tailor and toward the throne. They pointed toward a truth that the court tried to disguise beneath gold, land, and careful paperwork. The blood, running in Ethelreda's veins, did not belong to a man who spent his life bent over fabric and thread. It came from the man who wore a crown, the man whose decisions reshaped the kingdom, the man whose desire and secrecy had created her. Each new grant pushed the truth closer to the surface, even as the Tudor court tried desperately to bury it deeper. Every estate, every manor, every improbable act of royal kindness served as confirmation rather than concealment. They became markers of a hidden lineage, signposts leading directly to the child who lived her life between two identities. By the time the last grant was made in the year 1546, the illusion that Malty's success came from his tailoring could no longer stand on its own. It was too heavy with royal intention, too rich for the life of a servant, too precise in its timing, and so the truth shimmered through the cracks. Ethelreda Malt was raised as the daughter of a tailor, but the blood that shaped her destiny flowed from the man seated upon the English throne. Her life was stitched together from secrecy and privilege, every thread revealing the presence of a father who could not claim her, and a king who could not afford to let her go. By the late 1740s, Ethelreda entered a marriage that carried none of the softness, warmth, or trembling hope that people often imagine when they think of two lives joining. Her marriage was not a love story. It was an arrangement, a quiet transaction woven beneath the surface of Tudor politics. She became the wife of John Harrington, a man whose own life had risen and fallen like a tide pulled relentlessly by the crown. Harrington had served Henry VIII with loyalty, following the king through the shifting storms of his reign. Yet after Henry's death, he found himself swept into the chaos of the Thomas Seymour affair, a scandal that pulled many men downward and landed Harrington in prison. He survived, but the dangers he had faced left shadows along the edges of his life. When he married Ethelreda, Harrington gained something extraordinary, something far beyond what most men could ever hope to acquire through marriage alone. He received her enormous dowry, a fortune made of lands, estates, rights to collect rents, and authority over tenants. All of it supposedly belonged to the tailor John Malty. But no honest observer could ever believe that a tailor, no matter how skilled, no matter how loyal, had accumulated wealth of that magnitude. Property from former abbeys, manors stretching across Somerset and Berkshire, rights to tithes and clerical appointments. These things did not fall from the heavens into the hands of a man who spent his days cutting cloth. They were placed there, carefully, deliberately, with purpose. So the question rose quietly, like mist rising from a field at dawn. Who had truly arranged this marriage? The answer, whispered decades later, came from Sir John Harrington, the stepson of Ethelreda herself. In his book Nugae Antiquae, written many years after the events, he recorded a simple but astonishing truth. He wrote that Henry VIII had personally arranged Ethelreda's marriage to his own father. Not a minister, not a distant court official, Henry himself. The king had chosen Harrington for her. The king had decided her future. The king had placed her in the hands of a man he trusted. The detail sits in history like a soft breath on the back of the neck. Henry did not leave her unanchored. He did not allow her to drift into uncertainty or risk. He chose a man who understood loyalty, a man who knew discretion, a man who had lived long enough near the center of power to understand the kind of secret he was being asked to carry. Henry chose someone who would not speak, who would not question, who would not break under pressure or curiosity. A man who could keep safe a truth that, if spoken aloud, might shake the structure of the image Henry had spent his life crafting. Harrington, of course, knew the truth. He must have known it the moment he learned the size of Ethelreda's dowry. He must have known it each time he looked at the properties tied to her name, at the privileges granted to her family, at the quiet attentiveness that surrounded her like a veil. But he remained silent. Silence was safety. Silence preserved his lands, his standing, his peace. Silence let him keep the life Henry had allowed him to build. Silence made everything stable. Ethelreda, meanwhile, slipped into court life like a shadow, quiet yet never entirely unnoticed. She was not loud, not flamboyant, not demanding. She carried herself with a calm, effortless grace that did not need titles or ceremony to be seen. Those who encountered her often found themselves quietly surprised, sensing something noble in her posture, something naturally elevated in the way she moved and spoke. She seemed like someone born to the upper world, not forced into it, but shaped for it. Even without recognition, even without a title, she carried the unmistakable ease of a woman who belonged among the noble families of England. No one could fully explain it. How could the daughter of a tailor move with the poise of a gentlewoman? How could someone with no official lineage fit so seamlessly into the refined world of aristocracy? How could a girl whose birth was never celebrated carry the air of someone who had been trained from the cradle to navigate courtly life? But the truth hovered around her, soft, yet persistent. She had been raised with intention. She had been taught carefully. She had been watched over from a distance by a power that did not bear her name but shaped her life all the same. She was a presence without a proclamation, a figure who fit naturally into the world that had created her while never being publicly claimed by it. And though she lived quietly, she was never truly lost. Those who saw her felt the shadow of something grand moving behind her, the echo of a story no one dared speak aloud, a story written in her bearing rather than her name. She was, in every way that mattered, a woman shaped by the crown, even if the crown could never admit it. In the year 1554, a great upheaval swept across England, unsettling the fragile balance that held the Tudor world together. Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, had only recently taken the throne, carrying with her the weight of suspicion, fear, and the determination to secure her fragile reign. Not long after she ascended, a rebellion led by Thomas Wyatt rose like a storm against her authority, threatening her crown and shaking the kingdom with the possibility of civil conflict. Almost immediately, Mary turned her wary eyes toward her half-sister Elizabeth, young, intelligent, Protestant, and dangerously beloved by many of the people. In a time when alliances could form as quickly as a whisper, Elizabeth's popularity was a threat Mary could not ignore. Elizabeth was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed 18 years earlier. The cold stone walls still held the memory of that tragedy. Moisture clung to the air, seeping through the cracks. The hallways echoed with the silent dread of those who had walked toward their deaths within its walls. For Elizabeth, entering the tower must have felt like stepping into a nightmare carefully preserved by time. During her imprisonment, only 6 women were permitted to accompany her. Their role was both practical and emotional: to serve her, to watch her, to occupy the narrow space between duty and comfort. And among those 6 women was Ethelreda Moult Harrington. This detail has always made historians pause. At such a moment, when a princess might face charges of treason and possibly execution, one does not choose companions casually. Only the most trusted people are allowed near, only those whose loyalty is unquestionable, only those who will not break under pressure, who will not betray secrets, who will not falter when fear presses heavily upon the heart. Ethelreda was not merely a lady-in-waiting fulfilling a simple household task. Her presence in that small circle reveals a bond deeper than service, a closeness that cannot be easily explained by formal duty alone. Whether she and Elizabeth ever spoke aloud about the whispers surrounding Ethelreda's bloodline, no record tells us. Some truths, especially in the Tudor world, lived in silence, carried quietly between 2 people who understood their danger too well. Sir John Harrington, Ethelreda's stepson, later recalled that in the Tower, the women wept together, held each other, and shared their fear. It was a moment when rank, wealth, and ceremony meant nothing. It was simply 6 women, shut away from the world, clinging to one another as the threat of death pressed close around them. He wrote that Ethelreda and Elizabeth leaned on each other like 2 leaves blown by the same wind into the same dark corner. One faced the terrifying possibility of losing her head. The other lived with the lifelong risk of losing the truth of who she really was. 2 months passed. Interrogations came and went. Mary could not produce enough evidence to condemn Elizabeth, no matter how deeply she distrusted her. And so, Elizabeth was released. It was a moment heavy with relief, yet still laced with uncertainty, for freedom did not erase the dangers that lingered beyond the Tower walls. When Elizabeth walked out of that grim fortress, stepping into the pale light of morning, Ethelreda walked beside her. They left together, side by side, as they had endured the ordeal together. No dramatic declaration was made. No speeches were exchanged. There were no displays of affection or gratitude recorded by the scribes. Yet that silent walk spoke volumes. Ethelreda's quiet presence beside Elizabeth said what words could not. It confirmed that between the 2 women existed an invisible thread, delicate but unbreakable. A thread woven not through titles or documents, but through shared fear, shared endurance, and perhaps shared blood. It was a closeness that could not be erased by politics or danger, a closeness that neither of them ever needed to name aloud. In that moment, as they emerged from the place where so many had met their end, they walked not as princess and attendant, but as 2 souls bound by the shadows of the crown and by the secrets they carried in silence. As Ethelreda continued living a life suspended between light and shadow, the evidence of her true identity began to surface slowly, steadily, almost as though the truth itself had grown tired of being buried. What had once been whispers turned into written lines, and those written lines hardened into documents that even time could not erase. The first and most telling piece of this emerging picture came from the year 1547, in the will of John Moult himself. In that solemn document, Moult referred to her not as simply his daughter, but as Audrey Moult, my bastard daughter, begotten on the body of Joan Dingley. At first glance, the sentence seemed ordinary, the kind of phrasing one might expect in legal writing. But upon closer reflection, it revealed too much. Why emphasize her mother so explicitly? Why insist upon the word bastard with such rigidity, such formality, as if trying to secure a fragile facade in place? Ordinary craftsmen did not need to defend the story of their children so fiercely. Their wills rarely contained such pointed clarifications. It was as though the very neatness of the sentence betrayed its purpose. Then came the words written not by Moult, but by someone within the Harrington family, Sir John Harrington, the stepson of Ethelreda herself. In his recollections, he described Ethelreda not as the daughter of Moult, nor the child of a laundress, but plainly and boldly as the king's natural daughter. With that simple phrase, he pierced through the layers of silence and secrecy that had been laid over her life. He also wrote that the vast manors granted by Henry VIII to Moult had been bestowed out of special love and regard for the girl. Such a phrase, tender and unmistakably personal, could hardly be applied to the daughter of a tailor. Land was not given lightly. Manors were not offered casually. The words special love were not used in royal documents without purpose. And then, more than 100 years later, in the year 1656, another piece of evidence appeared, like an embers still glowing long after a fire has died. Jonathan Leslie, a deputy clerk, wrote a letter stating that King Henry had matched his darling daughter to John Harrington, even though she was a bastard, and that the king had given her the rich lands of Bath Priory as her dowry. The phrase darling daughter, though simple, carried a weight that no historian could ignore. No king refers to the child of a tailor in such affectionate terms. No monarch arranges the marriage of a random servant's daughter with such personal involvement. And certainly no ruler distributes precious church land, newly seized during the dissolution of the monasteries, to a girl with no royal blood. Each of these fragments alone might be dismissed as fragile pieces of family memory, hearsay, or clerical error. But together they formed a constellation pointing unmistakably toward the truth. Henry VIII never publicly acknowledged Ethelreda. He never wrote her name beside his own in any royal proclamation. No official account recorded her as his child. But in a world ruled by power and appearance, the absence of acknowledgement often hides the presence of fear. Silence, in this case, was not indifference. It was strategy. For kings do not arrange marriages for the daughters of their servants. Kings do not scatter land across counties like crumbs for someone whose life means nothing to them. Kings do not authorize grants from dissolved abbeys out of special love, unless there is a deeper, unspoken bond. The silence surrounding Ethelreda was not the silence of forgetfulness, but the silence of protection. It was the quiet that shields a secret too dangerous to speak aloud, a truth that could tear at the edges of the carefully constructed narrative Henry needed the world to believe. And so her identity was held in the shadows, protected, but also denied. She moved through life like a figure outlined by a faint glow, never fully illuminated, never fully concealed. The truth, however, continued to slip through the cracks left behind by royal intention. It appeared in wills, in letters, in memories, in the pattern of Henry's generosity. The truth sat beneath every decision made about her, waiting patiently for the day when history would finally look at these clues and see the shape they formed. In the end, the greatest evidence of her lineage was the very thing Henry never said. Silence became the loudest confession. Kings can hide their words, but they cannot fully hide their actions. And Henry's actions toward Ethelreda spoke more clearly than any proclamation ever could. It may have been the will of John Malty itself that shaped the way Elizabeth, who would one day become Queen Elizabeth I, treated Ethelreda not as a servant, not as a distant court lady, but as something much closer, something that resembled a true sister. The document, written in the year 1547, had exposed just enough of the truth for anyone perceptive to see through its thin veil. Whether Elizabeth ever saw the will directly, no one can say, but she had lived long enough in the world of Tudor secrets to understand the weight of silence, the meaning of odd coincidences, and the shape of truth spoken only through actions. When Elizabeth ascended the throne on the 15th day of January, in the year 1559, Ethelreda stood among the ladies of honour. She watched the young queen, her companion in the tower, her quiet confidant during the darkest hours of Mary's suspicion, step forward to claim the throne of their shared father. It must have been a surreal moment. The cold stone corridors of the tower, replaced by the brilliance and ceremony of coronation, the dread of execution replaced by the golden promise of a new reign. And somewhere in that crowd stood Ethelreda, silent, dignified, bearing witness to a transformation she had once feared might never happen. But it was as if her purpose had been fulfilled. Only a few weeks after the coronation festivities faded, Ethelreda died. No grand tomb was commissioned for her. No lengthy eulogies were written. No lavish monument was carved to mark her presence in history. She slipped quietly out of the world, leaving behind barely a ripple on the surface of public record. It was a departure as soft and understated as the life she had lived. She left behind one daughter, a girl named Hester, born around the year 1550. Hester appeared in records until the year 1568, and then she vanished, disappearing from historical documents, just as her mother had. Another shadow in a dynasty filled with bright names and hidden branches. And Ethelreda was not the only woman who carried Henry VIII's blood without ever being allowed to bear the Tudor name. Catherine Carey, the daughter of Mary Boleyn, was almost certainly fathered by the king, born during the years when Mary was his mistress. Elizabeth Taleboys, half-sister of Henry Fitzroy, was treated with an unusual degree of royal involvement, especially when it came to her marriage arrangements. These women moved through the corridors of power, educated well, respected quietly, and placed close to the heart of the royal household. Yet they were never granted the right to call themselves princesses, never acknowledged openly, never allowed to step forward into the light that their lineage should have given them, because they were daughters, illegitimate daughters. And in the Tudor world, that single fact rewrote their destinies. Henry VIII needed the world to know he could father sons. His legitimacy, his strength, his political narrative all depended on that truth. Sons could be claimed, displayed, groomed for power. But daughters complicated everything. They could be used by foreign princes, by ambitious noblemen, by political factions eager to twist their lineage into fuel for rebellion. And so these girls were guided, educated, protected but always hidden, loved perhaps but only in silence, provided for but never acknowledged, raised near their father's world but denied its name. Ethelreda embodied this cruel contradiction. She lived like a shadow cast by the throne itself. She was never called by her true name. She was never permitted to claim her father. She was never placed in the position that her blood should have granted her. Instead, she walked beside queens, yet remained unnamed, present yet officially invisible, shaped by royalty yet denied the title that would have revealed everything. And still, she lived. She stood at Elizabeth's side when Mary sought to end her sister's life. She held the hand of a future queen in the darkness of the tower. She moved through a world that pretended she was no one, even though everything about her life whispered that she was someone extraordinary. 500 years later, the silence finally loosened. Her name, once wrapped in secrecy, has been spoken again, not as a footnote, not as an invisible thread, but as a truth long overdue, a truth that refused to stay buried. Ethelreda existed. She matured, and history has finally remembered her. When we look closely at the story of Ethelreda, we begin to see that her life does not stand alone. She is only one figure among many, one shadow among several daughters pushed deliberately out of the light because Henry VIII needed only sons. Her story opens a painful chapter in the Tudor world, a chapter filled with girls who were loved in silence yet rejected before the public eye, girls whose very existence complicated the image of a king, obsessed with proving his virility and strengthening his legacy. Catherine Carey, the daughter of Mary Boleyn, stands as one of the clearest examples. Mary had been Henry's mistress before Anne Boleyn captured his infatuation. Catherine was born during those years of intimacy. Though Henry never acknowledged her, the pattern of her upbringing reveals truths more powerful than any written proclamation. Catherine was placed in royal households, raised close to the center of power, granted unusual favor, and eventually married into a distinguished family. These privileges did not fall randomly upon the daughters of minor courtiers. They were the privileges reserved for those who carried royal blood, even if that blood was never named aloud. Another shadowed figure is Elizabeth Taleboys. She was born in the year 1520, close to the birth of Henry Fitzroy, the king's acknowledged illegitimate son. Many believed she was Fitzroy's twin or his near-twin in age. What makes her case striking is that Henry personally intervened in arranging her marriage, an unusual action for a king toward the daughter of a small noble household. Royal involvement in a young woman's marriage was not granted casually. It was a sign of concern, of interest, of responsibility. And yet, while Fitzroy was raised as the proud symbol of Henry's ability to produce a male heir, Elizabeth Taleboys remained hidden. She was not honored. She was not mentioned. She was never placed among the Tudors, though her life bore every mark of royal engineering. The Tudor world required the silence of these daughters in order to preserve the carefully crafted image of Henry VIII as a man hindered only by Catherine of Aragon in his quest for sons. Acknowledging multiple illegitimate daughters would have shattered that narrative. It would have revealed a king who did not lack for children, only for sons. And in a society where male inheritance shaped politics, power, and stability, an illegitimate son could strengthen a king's image. But an illegitimate daughter carried risks. She could be used by foreign rulers, ambitious nobles, or rival factions. She could become a symbol around which enemies gathered. She could become a spark that ignited rebellion. Thus, like Ethelreda, these girls were raised with care, educated well, placed near the throne, yet never permitted to carry the Tudor name. They walked the palace corridors as shadows seen but unnamed, present but unacknowledged, recognized but never claimed. Everyone at court noticed their refinement, their education, their strange proximity to power, but no one dared to speak aloud the truth that hovered around them like a thin mist. They served queens. They attended great ceremonies. They married into notable families. And yet, they remained ghosts within their own lineage. Their existence pointed to a truth Henry VIII refused to confront, that he fathered more children than the kingdom officially recognized, but not all of them suited the political ambition that consumed him. Sons could be used. Daughters had to be hidden. Sons strengthened his image. Daughters threatened it. And so each girl was shaped into a figure who could serve the crown in silence. Trained, polished, protected, yet stripped of her birthright. Ethelreda, Catherine Carey, Elizabeth Taleboys. All these women lived at the edge of the Tudor world, near enough to feel the warmth of the crown but forbidden from standing openly beneath its light. Their stories reveal a kingdom that valued blood only when it served its narrative. A king who loved power more than truth, and a time when being born a daughter could mean a lifetime of erasure. They moved through history like quiet echoes of a legacy Henry never wanted. Acknowledged daughters of a king who needed sons, daughters of a man who could not bear the political cost of their existence. And yet, despite centuries of silence, their stories endure, telling us the truth the court once tried so hard to hide. In the official records, Ethelreda appears only as a bastard daughter of the tailor Malty, a dry sentence, cold and brittle, as thin as the ink used to write it. Yet behind that single line lay an entire campaign designed to erase her. Page by page, entry by entry, every document touching her existence was shaped to fit the story Henry VIII wanted the world to accept. Nothing more, nothing less. Why such effort? Because the truth, if spoken aloud, would crack the image he worked so hard to preserve. The image of a king who spent the years before marrying Anne Boleyn in supposed purity and restraint. The image of a man suffering nobly under an unwanted marriage, living chaste for political reasons, clean in conscience, righteous in intention. Henry believed himself chosen by God. His pride rested upon that belief. His break from Rome wrapped itself in the language of moral outrage. His reform of the church carried the tone of divine conviction. But if Ethelreda were ever acknowledged, the entire facade would crumble. It would mean Henry had lain with a laundress while claiming to be celibate. It would mean his declarations of purity were lies. It would mean the English Reformation, the greatest upheaval of the 16th century, was tangled with impulses he wanted buried, impulses that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with desire. And so everything tied to Ethelreda was smudged, softened, blurred into uncertainty. Her birth date? Unknown. Her birth year? Only guessed. Her mother? Named differently from record to record. Her given name? 3 versions. Non-definitive. Her wealth? Never explained. An ordinary person is forgotten by accident, but someone who must be forgotten is erased with intention. Yet truth has a strange patience. It waits. It settles into corners, into forgotten drawers, into the margins of surviving parchment, and eventually it rises again. It rose through the strange, impossible lands granted to a tailor, lands that no earthly needle could ever earn. It rose through family letters written quietly, without performance, without motive, simply reflecting what people knew. It rose through recollections passed down 3 or 4 generations, memories too persistent to die. It rose in the fact that Ethelreda walked beside Elizabeth inside the Tower of London, chosen in a moment where trust meant survival. It rose in Elizabeth's decision to keep her close, even after freedom returned. Piece by piece, the fragments drifted together. At first they looked like coincidence, like scattered details one could dismiss if one wished to protect the old narrative. But slowly they formed a shape, a silhouette, a human outline, a truth. What history tried to flatten began to lift itself back into depth. What had been twisted began to straighten. What had been buried began to breathe again. And the figure that emerged was clear. A woman stripped of her true name, so the king could guard his pride. A daughter denied so that a monarch could protect a story. A life bent beneath the weight of Tudor politics, but never emptied of the royal blood that had shaped it. Ethelreda stands before us now, not as a ghost, not as a footnote, but as someone who survived the machinery of erasure. A woman whose lineage was hidden but never broken. A woman whose existence endured quietly until time itself finally allowed her name to rise again. The life of Ethelreda Malt unfolded as if she were walking along a tightrope stretched between two worlds, suspended above a distance she could never fully cross. On one side stood the world of servants, the world where her recorded parents belonged, a place of modest duties and simple titles. On the other side stood the world of royalty, the world where her blood truly rooted her, the world where she had every right to stand if only she had been allowed to step forward openly. She wore velvet and silk, yet she was never called a noblewoman. She learned to read, to write, to bow, to speak with the gentle precision expected of the powerful, yet no title was ever granted to her. She entered palaces, served queens, and moved in circles reserved for women of rank. Yet no one dared acknowledge the real reason she received such privileges. Her existence resembled that of someone standing just behind a stage curtain. She could hear everything. She could see the light spilling across the boards. She could sense the world in which she belonged. But she could not step forward, and she could not walk away. She was permitted only to exist in that dim borderland. And it was precisely this shadowed existence that made Ethelreda one of the most uncomfortable figures in the Tudor court. She was not low enough to be dismissed, nor high enough to be accepted. She was not invisible enough to erase, nor legitimate enough to celebrate. She lived in a space too narrow for recognition and too significant for neglect. She appeared at important events, yet was never mentioned. She walked among queens, yet was never placed among princesses. She was a living secret, a secret that could breathe, speak, remember, and refuse to disappear. This is why Henry VIII kept her close, but never too close. It was a distance calculated with care, near enough that he could protect her, far enough that he could protect himself. She stood at exactly the point where affection, duty, and fear intersected. To an onlooker, her life might have looked peaceful, comfortable, even enviable. She lived in fine rooms, wore rich clothing, and moved within circles most women could only dream of seeing. But if one looked carefully, one could see the invisible architecture of her existence, walls of glass surrounding her on every side. Beautiful, shimmering, delicate, yet cold, and absolutely without exit. Her world was shaped by light she could feel, but was forbidden to touch. Every privilege she received was tethered to silence. Every luxury demanded that she pretend not to know the truth of her own life. Every step forward required her to remain precisely where she had been placed. She lived with the knowledge that her true identity could never be spoken aloud, that a single word too bold could shatter the careful structure built around her. She lived with the awareness that she was both protected and imprisoned by the same man. She was a daughter of a king, and also a daughter who could never claim that king. She was raised like someone important and treated like someone who must never be mentioned. This precarious balance shaped her from childhood to her final days. She learned to stand gracefully in places where she did not officially belong. She learned to speak softly in rooms that did not acknowledge her presence. She learned to move without leaving traces, to exist without claiming space, to breathe without disturbing the careful silence wrapped around her. And so, her life seemingly serene reveals itself as something far more fragile. A life carved out between two worlds. A life that shimmered like polished glass, yet held the chill of being forever unseen. A life in which she was allowed everything except the truth that defined her. Ethelreda died only a few weeks after Elizabeth ascended the throne. The timing felt almost unreal, as though her life had been tied to a secret task, one that quietly ended the moment Elizabeth became queen. No surviving document records what illness she may have suffered. No witness left behind a description of her final hours. No writer noted whether she passed in pain or in peace. No one even mentioned who stood beside her when she closed her eyes for the last time. There is only one certainty. She left the world in the same way she had lived in it. Silently, softly, like morning mist dissolving into sunlight. She left behind one daughter, a girl named Hester, born around the year 1550. Hester remained in scattered records for another 18 years, and then she too vanished. No husband, no children, No official burial, no inscription carved into stone. She slipped out of the historical landscape without leaving a trace, as though mother and daughter were carried away by the same quiet wind. Two lives, two shadows, drifting together beyond the reach of written memory. Perhaps both of them carried pieces of a truth the world wished to bury. Perhaps no one dared to probe deeper, afraid of disturbing the polished surface of Tudor history, a surface carefully smoothed to protect reputations, ambitions, and myths. Perhaps erasing them was easier than explaining them. The death of Ethelreda felt like an ellipsis, not a period. A life ending without the ritual markers of mourning. No weeping crowds, no tolling bells, no solemn prayers carved into parchment. Her passing was simply another silence, sealing the life of a woman forced to exist without her true name, a woman born into a lineage that could never acknowledge her, a woman whose identity was folded into secrecy the moment she drew her first breath. Yet silence cannot last forever. Not even royal silence. History can be distorted, reshaped, twisted by those who hold the quills, but it cannot be sealed completely. Small fragments always survive. A phrase in a will, a land grant that makes no sense. A family letter written without performance. An account preserved across 2 or 3 generations. A moment in the Tower of London recorded by someone who remembered. A memory too stubborn to fade. Piece by piece, those fragments gathered like stars that, once aligned, formed a constellation in her name. And slowly, Ethelreda Moult, the woman history tried to dissolve, rose again. A figure once blurred into obscurity became clear. A woman once denied acknowledgement stepped into quiet recognition. A daughter once erased returned to claim her place in the vast tapestry of Tudor blood. And at last, 5 full centuries after her birth, her name has been spoken clearly again. Ethelreda. Not a tailor's bastard, not a shadow in a corridor, not a forgotten woman, but the daughter of a king hidden, silenced, yet never truly lost. Ethelreda Moult is not the heroine of thick historical chronicles, nor the centerpiece of famous portraits hanging in grand galleries. Yet her story reflects something far more revealing than the triumphant tales usually preserved. She is a mirror, small but unbreakably honest, showing us the man behind the crown of Henry VIII, remembered for strength, brutality, 6 wives, and a kingdom torn from Rome, but rarely remembered for the daughters he allowed to vanish from the record. Ethelreda is one of the cracks in that polished image, a quiet fracture that exposes the truth behind the legend. A reminder that Henry was not only a ruler of iron, but also a man who harbored contradictions capable of affection, yet terrified of its consequences. His heart softened in secret and hardened in public. And she, his hidden daughter, became the embodiment of that conflict. He loved her, but he never acknowledged her. He gave her wealth, but refused her his name. He kept her close in the palace, but never let her stand openly beside him. Every gesture of care was paired with a boundary. Every gift was shadowed by silence. Every protection was tethered to concealment. Ethelreda represents all those who were hidden because great events demanded cleaner narratives than truth could offer. Her life is the quiet price, paid for a king's reputation. History, as always, favored those who won, those who wore crowns, those who commanded armies and reshaped nations. Their names fill the pages, their deeds define eras. But sometimes, it is the erased ones who reveal more about the age they lived in, the unnamed daughters, the hidden children, the inconvenient truths brushed beneath political carpets. Ethelreda carried within her several lives at once. The blood of a king, the silence of a servant, the upbringing of a noblewoman who was never allowed to claim nobility, and the end of someone who slipped out of the world without the acknowledgement she deserved. She was both royal and erased, both cherished and denied, both present and invisible. Yet the simple fact that we read her name now, that we speak it aloud centuries after her quiet death, becomes a kind of resurrection. By remembering her, we undo a piece of the erasure meant to bury her forever. Every retelling pulls her further from the shadows. Every detail reclaimed becomes an act of restoration. She lives again each time someone wonders why the king loved his daughter silently instead of proudly. She rises each time her story is whispered, as proof of hidden Tudor truths. She returns to history every time someone refuses to let her remain forgotten. Ethelreda existed. She walked the same halls as queens. She witnessed the terror in the tower, held Elizabeth's hand in the darkest hours, and lived as a secret woven tightly into the fabric of the Tudor court. And now, at last, she stands in the place that history once tried to strip from her. She is no longer a footnote, no longer a rumour, no longer a shadow behind a curtain. She is Ethelreda Malt, daughter of a king, survivor of silence, and a name that, 500 years later, has finally stepped back into the light.